I'm really delighted to join you tonight. From what I can understand, it's quite a diverse range of people. Some of you on the MBA programme, some of you from the university and further beyond. And I don't know how much time you spent thinking about global issues and sort of big business, how it connects globally. This is kind of bringing things back in to a very local perspective, and always I think it's useful to know where you are and to feel connected to where you are and to see how some of these issues play out in a local context. I've been in Exeter for about 10 years now and worked for this organisation since sort of 2011-12. I first got involved, and it was my first time in working in the community sector. Before that, I originally trained as a nurse, so I worked in the health service for 12 years, and then after doing both of my degrees, sort of got more into participatory action research for social change, and worked a lot with big systems and organisations and arts organisations as ways of asking questions in a different way, holding space in a different way for people to change things for themselves. One of my first shifts was into complementary medicine, which was quite different from when I'd been in kind of like 12 years working in a hospital. And that was because it was about how people found their own capacity to change things for themselves. It's kind of like been a thread through my own life. So what I'm going to share with you tonight is particularly focused around our journey as CoLab Exeter, which is a local organisation you might or might not know about, but also my own leadership journey through that, because I think it's always good to look at the personal and the global, because it's going to be filtered through the lens of my experience. So I'm going to share some things, and it spans through some of the tools that we've used to try and make sense of what is often quite a chaotic situation and environment, and certainly an environment where a lot of people are genuinely suffering. And so I sort of want to bring that to the forefront before I begin, because although I'm talking about things I'm passionate about in terms of social change and collaboration, I have to remember that I also represent a lot of people who do a very difficult job in very challenging circumstances, supporting people whose lives are not very pleasant at the moment. So that's kind of like the context for the conversation. So I'm going to share for about half an hour, and then I'd really like to invite you to, we sort of talked as I first came in about asking the real questions you want to ask. You know, don't feel like you have to be polite to me. Don't be rude to me either, but what I mean is, you know, ask the questions that you want to ask. And, you know, because I have worked across the different span, and sometimes people feel like if you're a charity, that people have to speak to you in a very kind of pleasant and nice way and not offend you in any way. But, you know, we're doing very real work, and I think the only way we start to connect with people who are working at other sections of society, perhaps on some of the same issues, is if we can have some real conversations about that. So I just want to put that out there up front. So one of the things I did when I did my degree was to go to China and look at this idea of crisis and opportunity as being a similar, kind of two sides of the same coin almost. And when I joined the organisation in sort of 2011 and 12, it was kind of post the election, a big sort of change, civil society really coming into its own. And this whole sense of that it isn't just about economics. This is really about a crisis of institutions, and institutions really not working well for people anymore at all different kinds of levels. And that's certainly been my experience. I'd had to get out of the health service because I was utterly frustrated by trying to be creative and trying to function as a person working in sort of challenging circumstances in an A&E, and then beyond that into other parts of my role within the kind of constraints of care plans and structures and all that kind of thing. So one of the things that really we were looking at when I first came into the organisation was about transformation. So I was brought in on a programme called Transforming Local Infrastructure. It was a national programme that was looking at how communities organise themselves differently, and the infrastructure organisations that were helping with that, like we were an organisation that set up after the war, that's how long we've been in Exeter, to organise people around social issues. So we were suddenly finding ourselves part of this conversation, that as being part of an institutional, or what we call now a system setup, what do we need to be within that? How do we respond to crisis and take those opportunities? So a lot of the conversations we were having were happening globally, so this is why the lens keeps going wider and smaller. So for us, this idea of a paradigm shift was about thinking beyond being what we'd always been, which was kind of like an umbrella organisation. And one person in a survey that we did famously said, we don't want an umbrella, you're just keeping the money and the information off everybody else. We want you to come and join us on the ground and figure out together what it is that needs to happen, what it is we need to be doing. And so, although that felt very personal, what we could see from looking broader, like in the charity we've got lots of people with research backgrounds, with wide practice backgrounds, that were bringing in these questions of how do we do things better. So this was something we looked at the time, this idea of betterness. It felt more simple than a lot of the language that was being used. Around us, public services were also in transformation processes. There was things like rewiring of public services, transformation agendas through health, but lots of things said what needed to happen without necessarily saying how on earth you did that. So the big challenge was about how do we, in a meaningful way, go about transformation without feeling like it's about restructure, it's about doing more with less. It's actually about just moving around the same pieces into a different configuration, but essentially ending up with the same thing. So that kind of spoke to us, you know, as people who were in a position where we were being invited to transform. What were the things around us that gave us some ideas about how that might happen, how we might do that? So we decided to kind of have lots of conversations with the people that were around us. So this, after we'd been through a process of exploration ourselves and a few reconfigurations of what we did with colleagues who were also doing this sort of infrastructure role, we decided we needed to do something quite different, and a kind of perfect storm of things happened to us that enabled that to happen. So in our building, we've got a big 10,000 square foot building. It's at the kind of dodgy end of Exeter, but it's a big space, and we shared it with the CAB, the Citizens Advice Bureau. They moved out, which meant that we could look at the space as a whole, as a community asset for the first time. So what we did is we went into partnership with an arts organisation who said to us, let's set up a series of installations rather than doing surveys. Let's get creative about asking people, let's just see where they're at and what it is that they want to do. So the first thing we looked at was some of the narratives that came through. What were the stories that people were telling? What were they saying? And a lot of what they talked about was isolation. They talked about cuts in funding, this thing about having to do more than less. They were saying that we have to work more collaboratively, but we're all in silos. All of our structures make us work in this very directed way, and we don't really know how to break out of that. Our service users, if we were going to call them that, talked about they don't want to be defined by their label. So they don't want to be offenders, victims, drinkers, all of these things that got put on them, because they became straitjackets of which it was almost impossible to break out of. If you've got a label like that, often that is what you carry, and you almost need permission to not be that anymore from somebody else. So you're really giving away your power. And they said that we want you to be more ambitious for us. So we saw that there was something quite emotional in this, that it wasn't just about logic and what do we need to do and strategy. It was kind of more about what people were feeling. So we went deeper into this as a design group and really kind of asked more questions about what it was that people wanted. And these that came out of it is a distillation of a lot of conversations. These became our design principles. So we started to think about how we change, how we do things, the physical space that we're in, what are the components of this? We also applied for and got about £500,000 of funding from NHS capital funding to transform the space that we were in. And what we basically said was that we want to create a wellbeing hub for people to be co-located, where we can have somewhere to receive people who want to come here, who want to access learning, who need to get support, who want information, but also people who maybe want to work in a different way and they need a place to practice different ways of being together and different ways of operating that didn't exist in their current environments. And that was lots of different environments. People were quite apathetic. They'd seen so many different initiatives come through, so many different agendas, and it was just kind of like another thing, another bit of money, and nothing. This is going to be called this, it will be here for a couple of years and then it will move along. So we were up against it really, we were up against a lot of this apathy. But there were some things in there that just felt good to us, that just kind of felt like there's something in this. And those were making this a space where people can give and gain. And we realised that what they were asking for was an exchange. They didn't want to be recipients. People wanted to feel like they were doing something together and there was a mutuality in it. And this was kind of the beginning of this sort of collaboration that was really emergent from the conversations. We didn't impose that. It came out of what people were asking for. They really understood that learning was something that a lot of people that they were either working with or if it was them personally had lost access to. Adult learning, the budgets were slashed. There was really very, very few places where you could do anything other than maths and English, routes into employment, that kind of thing. The big adult learning opportunities of old just started to disappear. And so that kind of feeding the creativity and having a space where people could really learn together, to change together, disappeared. So we had to create relationships with local colleges through their community learning budgets to bring in that very different kind of learning, because we had a lot of people in the building who were very much sort of Paulo Freire orientated, that learning is how you change society and it's a right. People have a right to be able to learn in order to change their circumstances. And another thread that came through was about culture. How do we build a culture that's based on people's strengths and what is present and not what's absent or wrong or different about us? And that wasn't about kind of smoothing out this in this very PC way. It was a disruptive kind of space. Where can we actually look at what culture's emerging and how we feel about that? And that was kind of really before Brexit and all of those other big forces, Trump, kind of took hold. It was sort of before all of that. So all these things became then the design principles for the building. So what we have, I want to draw your attention first to these two images. These two images became what we worked with, and what we kind of put into a lot of our presentations. So on the right, is what the building looked like before we did anything with it. So we had no natural light, it came in from the ceiling, we were like in this dark, cold, freezing cold in the winter, it's over a car park, boiling hot in the summer, we were all in traps or boxes, it just was not a good environment, it wasn't conducive to collaboration. And what we started to talk about was this tribal mentality. How do we bring people's colour? How do we have a space that's quirky and different and doesn't look like other spaces? How do we, as soon as you walk in, there's a suggestion that this is a space where you are important, you are valued, interesting things happen here, you maybe can speak in different ways. So we sort of had that. We looked at what our assets were, we knew we had the building and we wanted to transform that. So that was the change we wanted to make. We knew we had lots and lots of expertise in the space, How do we leverage that expertise? That's kind of part of the question. We had relationships that we'd had since, 1947. Really, we were embedded in the community. But how do we connect people back up? Because lots of those relationships were separate, individual. We were either talking to police or to health or to social care, to mental health, to the community. They were all really different directions and didn't fit well. And we had money coming in, and it was about how to invest it and how did we need to use the resource that we had. So these were all the kind of pieces of the jigsaw, if you like, that we had to work with. So when I was doing my, I think it was just after I'd done my master's degree and I was sort of working in evaluation then, I came across this tool. I was actually at an amazing conference that was from the Society for Affective Learning, SEAL they were called, and it was at Keele University. It was 2 days and it was full of kind of like amazing learning and arts organisations that were talking about how you open up space for people to think differently. And one of the presenters was a guy called Richard Barrett, who's the designer of this tool, which is a cultural values survey. Those of you that know your models might recognise that this is, don't recognise what it was based on? Maslow, yeah? So it's based on an expanded Maslow's hierarchy of needs, bringing into that sort of Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, really looking at different dimensions of people. But essentially what you've got on the left is your standard Maslow. So the bottom triangle is standard Maslow, and that's about that we need to have our survival needs, our foundation in place before we can think about relationships, before we can then go to self-esteem. And the top of that pyramid was always something called self-actualization, that nobody fully knew what that was. So what they did was to open that out into thinking about, so what are the higher levels of things? Being in internal cohesion, feeling like you're connected to your values and your purpose. External cohesion, where you meet people, your tribe, who are working to those same objectives and being of service to humanity and the planet. So there's that real kind of span of things. And then in the green in the centre is the energy for change. And we often forget about that you think if you have a good plan and people, that will equal change. But I don't know how many you've worked in sort of change processes. Keeping the momentum and the energy going is one of the hardest things. So on the right, what we've got is a full spectrum organisation or system. So it's those same words expanded out to be what that looks like in the system. So you've got financial stability, customer satisfaction, high performance, etc., etc. So what this does is it enables you to map the cultural health of a group of people. So we decided to use this to map where people were at who were going to move into the space. And we had 65 people at that point, at the beginning, who did it, who were like workers and managers who were going to be working around this quite complex group of people. And essentially, we asked them 3 questions. Who are you and what are your values? 90 words on a page, they choose 10, just off gut instinct. Second question, what are the values you see in the current culture of sort of joint work around this client group? Again, 90 words, they choose 10. And finally, if these are our common objectives and this is our vision, what would it look like if we'd realised this? What values would be in place? So those are the only 3 questions that they answered, along with some kind of a qualitative box where they could explain some of their answers. This is what it looks like when you get that back. So you basically get a profile of personal values, a profile of the current culture values, and one of the desired culture values. And what we see from that, just kind of like to give you a headline of what you're looking at, in the personal values column, what you'll see is all the dots, so these are the choices, are at level 5. So that's where you've got the most proliferation of values. And that means that these people working in this work are level 5 orientated people. They need to be connected to their purpose, their passion, They need to be able to bring that to work. They need to be able to be creative and express what they believe in their work. Otherwise, they will switch off, they will sabotage, they'll get sick, they won't engage with the program, if you like. They have to believe in it, in other words. So that's kind of like who people were. Also, there was nothing at level 4, which meant that's not what they were talking about. They were talking about not the energy for change, but this sense of purpose being stifled was kind of like what was coming through. The lists underneath it are like from the top to the bottom, the rankings of the actual values that people chose. So making a difference, enthusiasm, compassion were the top 3 things for this group of people. If we move to the current culture, we'll see there are white dots there. Those are what we call the potentially limiting values, the things that cause resistance, fire blanket, squash down, whatever you want to call it, in your system. So in this group of people, 6 out of 10 of the values chosen were potentially limiting. And that creates what they call an entropic force, a resistance in your culture that just exists. So everything that you try to do, that will push back all of the time. So what we understood from that was that we were really clear about what was wrong with the culture. Uncertainty about the future, wasted resources, bureaucracy, blame, competition, drug and alcohol use. These were the things that were creating that kind of squash down in the culture. And we had a rate, so they put a rate on this because they've done hundreds of these all across the world. 29%, and they said to us, with an entropy rate that high, you're looking at 3 to 5 years of work on your culture alone before anything you're proposing has got any chance of flying. So it's quite a lot to actually hear that. So we took this information and we also understood that people not only were telling us what was wrong, but they were also really clear about what needed to happen. So what the results told us was that staff wanted a different experience of community, a different way of being together. So we kind of had to think about what might be the ways that we do that. They wanted to be able to stay balanced and well and connected to their purpose, which is that level 5 stuff. They wanted, so leaders in that group wanted to learn how to create environments where compassion could thrive. So if you look back, compassion, it's in orange there, it exists very high in who people are. It's there but low in the current culture because of all these forces that are squashing it down, and it's high in terms of where people wanted to go. So what we understood, that there was something unlocking about being compassion orientated that kind of wasn't fully flying in the current culture that people really, really wanted to see. And so they said to us, people, you need to really pay attention to how people are staying connected, as if you can achieve this, if you can achieve multiple connection points where people can bring themselves truly into that space, things will change themselves. And we were skeptical, but that was kind of like how we designed then what we did. Another big part of that was then, as a leader in that circumstance, suddenly I felt quite out of my depth, and so did my colleagues working in that. How do we work with this information? What was the best thing to do with it? And so I applied for and got on a CLAW social leadership program, which I did for a year, which came with a learning budget, which was just, when you work in the charity sector, you do not get a learning budget. And so I had, for the first time, money to invest in my own learning. I went to Canada for 6 weeks, worked with social entrepreneurs out there to really understand collective impact and things they were doing about animating communities. And I went to Schumacher College at Dartington to work with Margaret Wheatley, who was running a week course there for leaders from all over the world. There was people from everywhere, South Africa, New Zealand, Europe, everywhere. And they'd come because she was such an inspiration. She was an inspiration to me. Her main leadership model is what she calls leader as host. So how you host change rather than being the heroic leader who stands out at the front. But when we got there on the first day, we were all sat there waiting to be inspired. It's going to be all right. She's going to tell us how to do it. What she said was, it was just after the Trump election, so this was in the May after the Trump election had happened. He'd just sort of come in, and she said, I'm devastated, I'm grieving, and I don't believe that we can change this. I think these systems and structures have to collapse. And what you have to look at is in your own sphere of influence, what you can do based on some really simple principles. And people there were looking for big solutions. They wanted big solutions. But she was talking about growing things from a very personal place. She said you need to establish what she called islands of sanity. Places where people can come in small groups, in your own sphere of influence, and they can approach these big problems with what she called dwelling mind, which was kind of like I think it's a Buddhist sort of philosophy, which is about allowing the whole spectrum of that problem to just be. So the fact that there are big things that we can't change, that we feel devastated about, angry about, to allow that to all be there, don't rush to fix it, don't flee from it, and allow what is needed, what you can do, how you can respond to emerge from being in that space. So people were quite furious with this suggestion. But by the end of the week, when we'd all explored it, we all made a commitment to go back to our respective organisations and to sort of try and do that. One of the things that we did as well was we did 3 Theory U processes. So I don't know if any of you have been in any Otto Scharmer workshops. So every autumn, MIT, led by Otto Scharmer, runs a 3-month Impact Hub learning program where people from all over the world connect up and learn together. It's free, and you can bring together people around a social challenge where they can look together, doing the learning process together, at how they might change that. So we ran this in 3 successive years. And just to give you a bit of a flavour of something that sort of fed into this, what he was talking about was that we need to create these sort of new enabling infrastructures that help people co-sense, co-develop and co-create their entrepreneurial capacities by serving the real needs of their communities, because that mobilises something quite emotional, you're moved literally. So the movement is not just an intellectually, I'm going to be part of that movement, that sounds good to me. You feel it come through you, that matters to you and you want to be involved in it. And that's certainly what we were seeing, these surges in people that we were having these conversations around, wanting to do something quite radical about how we tackle some of the problems in the city, like homelessness, like the fact that we've gone from being 13% of vulnerable women in our building with the most complex needs to 63% women in 3 years because of the circumstances and the lack of support available to them. So these were kind of all the processes that we did. There was more than that, but in half an hour I'm not going to get a chance to tell you. But basically it was all these different spaces for change. The physical space, which became CoLab Exeter, emerged out of all of this process. So we went from being the top, which is what we were, ripping out the space entirely, like literally we just gutted the building. And then we built up from that like a village around a river. So the whole metaphor changed. Everything that we've been working on had been about being a frontline service, the war on drugs, the fight against teenage pregnancy. All the metaphors were war metaphors. So we wanted to move to being an ecological metaphor. And so we had this idea that if you look at our building, I don't know if you can tell on there, but it curves all the way down. It's like an S shape. And when the light comes through the ceiling, it looks like there's a river of light on the ground. And the architect said to us, it looks to me, and hearing what you're saying and looking at the building, that when people come in, they're in the rapids, it's chaotic, but they're surrounded by this village of people, and they can see this journey that they must go on, that they're in control of their craft, and they go from end to end of it, and we're just here to support them, but they stay in control of it. And these little things, these different metaphors, just brought a little bit of hope into some of these really difficult conversations. And so now we're at a point where we've got 38 agencies in the building, about 150 staff working there and volunteers on top of that. We have a specialist GP, probation, mental health, social care, housing, substance misuse, alongside all VC, voluntary sector and social enterprise organisations who work to these 4 themes of work: better recovery, social justice, belonging, which includes addressing homelessness, and well-being. Our role in that is to be the core. So there's a business element to that, the hub management, making it sustainable. We don't get any funding to run the space. It's totally self-sustaining. So we have to be entrepreneurial as well as being to our charitable objectives. The infrastructure support is about the connected community, the collaboration, and then the system evolution and the collective impact is about how we take that learning out and how people from the system come in. So to give you an example, we had a meeting with some people from Plymouth. I think they were from the council and various places. We asked them to have a conversation in this quite a disruptive space, and they had to take their lanyards off in order to have the conversation. There was something about putting down, taking off and saying they weren't that. They were stepping away from being this lanyard, name, badge organisation and being yourself in that space. And this is what we see a lot. A lot of people come from the system to be themselves in a space where they can have a conversation about how we're going to do, what we're going to do about some of the things that are around us. So I'm not going to read this too much to you. I think you can look at these, but essentially what we're looking at is an enabling infrastructure for people to connect, to participate, to speak their truth, to have it heard and not be responded to in a negative way, to be able to try things, to fail, to learn from that and to try again. And this way you get a learning community that actually trusts itself to be able to try things and to be able to learn from that and move forward. And those people that are stuck in these big institutions and who want to be part of that movement, I think what we've found is that this idea of creating these spaces is what needs to be replicated. So now they want to come in and be part of that with us, but actually I think that's about how we create those spaces more widely. Where do we have those conversations for multiple people to really genuinely figure out how to solve problems, rather than to talk about strategies and structures. Let's talk about how we do something about this today by 3 months' time. That is what engages and motivates people. In 2019, early last year, we wanted to see, after doing all of this really hard work, and it has been really hard work and kind of financially very precarious as well, we redid the survey with a group of people. This time with a larger group. We had 205 people in the building, took the survey, and a third of those were service users. And we did exactly the same thing. We sort of asked them the same questions. And what we found was that the entropy in the system in the 3 years had reduced by 21%. And the people who run the survey, who are in America, said if we'd have achieved 10%, that would have been phenomenal. They said this is just like an absolute transformation. And what we understood was, because we had a lot of control over our environment, we were able to implement things that perhaps in a bigger system where you've got multiple factions like kind of pushing against each other, multiple forces, it is less easy to do that. So I absolutely hold my hands up there. But we absolutely saw this shift, and you can feel it. It's palpable in the building. People are alive, awake, connected, talking, having conversations about what needs to change, challenging the status quo. If you also look at level 5 now, we have level 5 is still really strongly represented, but it's at all levels, it's very equal. So who people are is expressed in the current culture, and it's still really clear that's where they want to go. What you also see is in the desired culture, there's a good, strong amount of information, dots there, like representation at level 4, which is about the energy for change. And that tells us there's a lot of energy for change about more things. So rather than resting on their laurels, what people are saying is they're ready to do more. They want to do more. They're more ambitious for change. Compassion if you notice, is also now the top value in all of those columns. So it's moved up, it's top of who they are, it's top in terms of what they're doing, it's top in terms of where they want to go. So we're really seeing now that there's this strong community spirit, there's an identity and a reputation. People who just want to work in the building, they'll come and say, can I base myself in here? Can I just work here? Can I volunteer here? Because they just want to be in it and feel it and be part of those conversations. And I won't read these to you, but this is kind of like, sometimes you sort of need to hear it from people, that you can see that there are strengths there in terms of people are feeling like that it's working well, but also they can still see that the political forces can pull things out in an instant. Like we've had agencies that have lost their funding, that have kind of like reduced what they're paying people. We've still got most of the workforce are the most poorly paid people, lots of in-work poverty. I had a member of staff who came to me and said, I have a choice of whether I get the bus home or whether I get the bus into work. I can't afford to do both. And that's just the reality of what people are dealing with. And so it's kind of having compassion for people working in those very challenging circumstances and realising that there's a political challenge to make and asking, do we want to be political? But also realising that this is not now just about what we think as leaders, it's about really seeing that leadership distributed throughout everybody in there and looking at what can I lead myself, whether that's leading change in my relationship, my family, my workplace or my city. The unintended consequences of that are things I've just talked about. So we're now up to between 1,200 and 1,500 visits a month to the space. It is a really rocking place. And some of those people are very challenging. They are people who've got nowhere else to go, people who antisocial behaviour, street drinking. They lots of women with complex needs who are being victimised in the city, who have real issues in terms of hanging on to their kids for all kinds of reasons. This is the real stuff. This is kind of like the real underbelly of the city, but it happens even in a city like this. I come from Manchester, where I kind of expect that more, but it's pervasive. This is now going into all sections of society. And we're kind of operating a bit like a social A&E, where the conversation now we're having with the local hospital is about how we work together, so how we look at being some of that immediate social response, and how we sort of work looking at who goes into the A&E at the hospital, and equally how they take people from us, because we are not a provision. We're not actually about providing healthcare. We should be about signposting and support, and all that gets quite blurred. So where we're at now, and the things on the left are questions that I've been asked in the new year. So these are the kind of range of questions. If you're trying to imagine what it's like for me to do my job, I had a person saying, can I have £5 to get someone to an appointment? It's January, I'd usually pay for it myself, but I can't afford it. I need to get this person to an appointment. And just what that raises about safeguarding of people in their roles as well. That's what they're feeling they need to do because the money's not there in the system. A night in a hotel for a woman who hasn't got a local connection and doesn't qualify to sleep in the shelter. These are things that as a worker you're faced with. So it's this very real stuff day to day, all the way back to we have businesses coming to us saying, we think we could do like a modular build around small houses for homeless people. Do you want to partner with us? Mental health charities saying, let's do a different kind of response to mental health together as a collaboration. We want to provide space for all those conversations, but this now, as we're a collaborative community, it's almost now, it's rippling out to be more of how are we a collaborative society in the city and beyond? How do we want to take the learning from something like this and the asset that is the space and the will and the energy and really bring in a different level of expertise to take that where it needs to go? And this is very timely. Collaborate, CIC, based in London, they work all over the country doing collaboration projects. Collaboration is their business, it's their bread and butter. They actually have worked with us now for a couple of years. They have just produced a manifesto for a collaborative society that's going to be informing lots of conversations that will be happening with particularly local authorities and business and people that are trying to work closer together, sort of like business and inter-business societies, collaborative societies with the actual society. Sometimes community and society gets a bit blurred of what you're talking about, at what scale. So, but what they talk about in this document is about how we invest in the conditions that give the people the opportunity and the means to participate. Ask what unites us, what we stand for, and look at how we transition to reshape our organisations, government, public services, institution and economy. And what they've found going through the country is a lot of people inside institutions want to have this conversation, but they're very afraid. They're very tired. They don't see anything that's kind of on the horizon that gives them hope. And so they want to find a way of asking these questions and having this conversation. So this is what they're hoping to broker. And what we're interested in is how we participate in this locally. So we've moved from individual leadership to collaborative leadership and how we do that. And in this document, they talk about the collaborative mindset. And I think the cultural work has really helped us to understand what are the components, what has worked in terms of having this collaborative mindset. And this is about, still about being bold and taking risks and chances, leading by example, sharing power, sharing resources, creating space, being compassionate, all of those things. And so our challenge right now is how we foster that. So all the components are there, the leadership, the organisations, the organising, the communities, the public services, the economy. They see that as being part of the same conversation. So all of those things are happening and where they're expressing, because you're probably trying to imagine what that might look like. These are some of the conversations that are happening right now in CoLab. So one of them is looking at a women's centre for Exeter with no refuge. We've barely any provision now in children's centres unless you're absolutely on your arse. It's really hard out there for women, and we're just seeing that increasing complexity, families in their cars, increased food banks. And rather than looking at the negatives, what we want to really do is find a women's centre that we can have maybe accommodation that's around that. So we've got a whole range of partners who've started having that conversation, and this should be about enabling and empowering women from all stratas of that conversation, not just the most vulnerable, about how women help women and then how that helps families and how that helps young men, and so it goes. Specialist accommodation, this modular accommodation is another conversation. Partnerships around some of the issues. A compassionate community meeting house. We've got a big space in the centre of the building that we want to use as a community space, but not just kind of like for meetings, but for co-design conversations. So a place where we can really start to have these challenging conversations in the principles of what we're working to, so people feeling like they can share what's true for them and do something about it. Bring some of the resources that people want to invest into the projects that come out of that. We're working with an organisation called Kelly Chase, who are a national funder that fund work around complexity. They want to invest in a local system changes learning programme so that people from across the system can come together over a period of time and start to look at what skills they need to actually enable them to be able to collaborate and work together in a meaningful way, and not just in a strategy and because they're in the same building or they've been aligned. It's kind of more about how you give people that collaborative mindset that we were talking about earlier. The Urban Learning Academy, we've had a big investment from Cornwall College, the Bicton College, about bringing, again, a lot of that, how we care for the land and how we upskill people to participate locally in that. They want to bring that into the city and to see how we use those spaces and engage those people, and the community mental health project that I've already talked about. So finally, I'm trying to get through all of this, we think you're here because some of these aspirations speak to you. I'm really interested in asking you about the connections and understanding the connections to your own conversations, your own challenges, about what you think about collaboration in society, and whether you feel like it's just a buzzword or you've got your own genuine experience of that, or if you feel that's something we need to invest in more. And then about how you might want to get involved. So one of the immediate things that we've got is we're having a Dreaming Big event at the end of next month. And this is really for people who have come step forward from across different business and from local authority, and people who really are bringing something to the conversation, who want to kind of do something radical. And so we're starting that conversation based on learning what we've learned, similar to what we've shared tonight, but then to come out of that there would be some genuine projects that people could work together on, so that we can connect people in the city who are movers and shakers in this field, but all quite separately, who come to us separately, and get them in the same room. So I want to extend that invitation to people here, because I think if you've shown up tonight to come to something like this, there's going to be either for yourself or for people that you work with a connection to that. Whether you bring a question to it or whether you bring yourself to it, we're open to either. So thank you for your time.